Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Royal Armouries. My name's David, I'm part of the live interpretation team, and today I'm going to be telling you the story of a man known as James Harold, who was an officer with the Gurkhas during the Second World War fighting the Japanese in Burma. He was part of a brigade of men known as the Chindits. So with that said, I'll get started with the story. One in three of us never made it home. On average, we lost around a third of our body weight, and, well, militarily speaking, we didn't achieve all that much. Still, as a source of morale for the Commonwealth in its darkest hour, I'd like to think we were just the tonic it needed. Now, it's fair to say the creation of the Chindits was a difficult one. Our creator was a man known as Ord Wingate, rather disliked by most of the officers in the Indian Army at the time. Still, he managed to get the ear of a very important man, General Archibald Wavell, Chief and Commander of the Indian Army at the time. And once the general was convinced, he didn't hang about, he quickly created what was known as the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, otherwise known as the Chindits. Now, this brigade of ours was made up of mainly inexperienced troops, mostly made from the Indian Army at the time, although there were men from Britain. I believe the Royal Liverpool Regiment came all the way from England from coastal duties to go and serve in India. I did feel sorry for these men. But you see, they'd never even seen a jungle, let alone served in one. There was a lot of training ahead for them. Mind you, there's a lot of training ahead for all of us, I suppose. Started off with fieldcraft, force marches, but then we started to move into more specific things, such as tracking and sabotage. Although the most interesting thing was that we had to rehearse for the RAF, because you see, on this operation of ours, we were going to be supplied strictly by air. Rather commonplace today, but of course at the time, completely unheard of. Now, of course, we had 3 months of training, all in all, and then we were finally deemed ready to go into Burma, behind enemy lines, and act in an offensive capacity as Wingate had always intended. However, things didn't always go to plan. You see, our operation was part of a much larger one, involving both the American and the Chinese forces. The idea being that the Americans, Chinese, and the British would all lay down a front line into Burma, where the Japanese would be distracted. We would then go behind those lines and blow up railways, sabotage things, weaken the Japanese resolve, and hopefully allowing that larger force to push further in. However, we got some grave news. The Americans were told that their resources were needed elsewhere, and they pulled out of the operation. Then we're told the Chinese heard about the Americans leaving, and they also lost faith in the operation and left. That left the British all alone, and quite frankly, we were outmanned, outgunned, and we were in no condition to lay down a front line. So, well, even the British left their very own operation, leaving us high and dry. I used to joke, I used to say, the Chindits, we were defeated before we'd even left India. Now, if it wasn't for our creator, Wingate, I think that would have been the end of us. However, he was quite a zealous man, at times a very convincing one, and he managed to convince General Wavell of our purpose. In fact, I think he says the words, "It is now or never for the Chindits. There's plenty of information to be had, plenty of experience to be gained from their deployment." And whilst I imagine he might have chosen a few other select words to convince the General, I won't show those or share those in polite company, I'll say. Regardless, whatever he did say, we finally got our orders through, and those orders were simple. We had to take a 3-day train journey from the south of India to the north. There we had a 133-mile march to the border, 12 days of rather welcome rest, and then a further march over the border into Burma and over the Qingling River. Now, once we arrived there, we were permitted a few luxuries, one of which was you didn't have to shave your beard. I've grown quite fond of mine. There weren't too many barbers in the jungle, if you understand. Now, what sort of equipment did we have? Well, we had everything you see before you. Khaki shirt, slacks, pair of short gaiters, wedding, backpack, haversack. This all came to around 66 pounds all in all. And in regards to weapons, well, you got what you were given. Now, I was lucky enough to get my hands on one of these. This is the Thompson submachine gun M1A1, comes with a 20-round stick magazine of 45 ACP. I was given 6 spare magazines for that. As an officer, I was also issued one of these, a .38 Webley revolver, and given 40 spare rounds for that. Now, I will admit that can sound like a lot of ammunition to the uninitiated. However, to a man like myself, it really wasn't enough. You see, our supplies were going to be 6 days, at best, sometimes several weeks. So I used to always tell my men, look after your ammunition, and your ammunition will look after you. However, in case I did not follow my own advice, there was one last weapon I had by my side, which I was very fond of, and that was the Kukri, the legendary fighting knife of the Gurkha. Now this thing here is quite a terrifying thing to behold. In fact, I've got a great story for you. We were laying siege to a Japanese entrenchment. Now, we managed to take out most of the Japanese forces, but then we found ourselves without ammunition, the Japanese machine gun nest still in operation, and I told everyone to keep their heads down and simply wait for them to run out of ammo. That way we can maybe storm it by hand and finish the fight. However, as I turned to my left, I spotted Gurkha, who clearly didn't share my patience. You see, he had a kukri in his hand and a smoke grenade in the other, and before I could say anything, he'd already begun stalking up towards the machine gun nest. Now, as I watched, the Gurkha arrived outside the entrance, stood there, took the smoke grenade, rolled it inside, and he waited. Now, I watched as the smoke started to billow out through the nest. I could hear the voices of panicked Japanese soldiers, and then suddenly 4 of them come running out of the entrance. And I watched this Gurkha take off 4 heads from 4 sets of shoulders, one after the other. Yes, I admit it is a gruesome example, but it speaks wonders about how effective this really was. Now, of course, with a knife like this, there are many myths, stories, legends that revolve around it. One of my favourite being that once you've drawn the kukri from its sheath, you cannot place it back in there without first tasting blood. And unfortunately, whilst it does make a very good story, it really is a complete bunch of nonsense. You see, yes, you use this to chop your way through your enemies, but you also use it to chop your way through the undergrowth. You use it to open up a can of corned beef. This was as much a tool as it was a weapon, and I was rather glad to have it by my side. Now, once we reached Burma, our operation was split into 2 major groups. We had half of us going south, that was the distraction, and then half of us going north, the main group, the group that's going to do the damage. Now, I was assigned to the northern group. That was me and my 3rd and 2nd Gurkha rifles. We're around 350 men strong, and we're part of the 3rd column. And the leader of that column was a man known as Mike Calvert. You may have heard of him. Now, how to put it? Mike was quite possibly the most remarkable man I'd ever met. Built a bit like a boxer, keen swimmer, Army champion at both. But that's not why I remember the man. No, the reason I remember him is because he could lead men through example. He never asked you to do anything he would not do himself. He was always at the front of the firefight, never behind. Put it this way, he couldn't speak a word of Nepalese. Not a single word. He couldn't say hello, he couldn't say thank you. Yet my Gurkhas would follow him into hell and back because they could just see that he was going to win this war for them. And I can tell you now, with a man like Mike Calvert leading your column, you rarely fell into Japanese ambushes, although they were constantly falling into ours. In fact, I remember on one occasion, we're laying down an ambush for a Japanese patrol. Now the idea is very simple. We're going to stand by the path, in the long grass, and wait for them. Now we waited for some time, and at one point I thought they weren't going to arrive until eventually I spot them. Now they're coming around the corner, completely unaware we're here. The rifles are by their sides, they're chatting to each other. Now the idea was I was going to take up my Thompson, track them down the path, and then give the signal. So as I was waiting for it, the Gurkha fires too early. Soon the rest of us were just to join in. We start raking the jungle in automatic and rifle fire. Now the first Japanese soldiers we caught this fusillade of bullets, they twist, they jerk, they hit the ground. Now the second, they managed to get their rifles shouldered, but then they too follow suit. Now the entire jungle just erupts in the sound of gunfire. There's the smell of cordite strong in the air, and then there's absolute silence. As if nothing had even happened. The only evidence of any ambush now happening lay down in that hollow before us. Now I remember going over to count the bodies. There was 1, 2. There was only 9 bodies. And I could have sworn there were more of them. Rifle fire wings overhead. I get myself out of the hollow, down into the long grass. There I wait. A grenade goes off. I decide the best course of action now is trying to find my men leading through this ambush. Now I take myself out of the long grass and I happen upon the track. Now as I look up, there he is. I give a quick burst from the Thompson. And then what happens next, I'll never forget. The man's body just arcs backwards. Rifle slips from his hand and it hits the ground with a thud. And don't ask me why, but I found myself walking over to him. The face was grey, blood trickling out the mouth. Eyes still looking at me rather accusingly, in fact. And that's when I realised these men, they weren't monsters, superhumans hunting us in a jungle. They were fathers, sons, husbands to families that they'll never see again. But because of what I've just done. Still, there's no point feeling any guilt over it. I know for a fact that that man would have shot me without hesitation if he'd seen me first. Now, I found myself going back to my men, see if they're all right. And by some miracle, those bullets seeking them out in the grass had not struck them. But they found one. I saw one of the Gurkhas lying on the ground, blood all over his stomach. Poor man had nearly been cut in two. And I knew as soon as I saw him, he was not coming home with us. It's that point my mind starts to drift towards my haversack, you see. In there I had some small capsules given to me for such an occasion. Tiny little things filled with morphine. They put a man out of his misery rather permanently, if you understand me. And to my shame, I hesitated for quite some time. The man was left there screaming in agony because I didn't have the courage to do what I had to. But after enough of the shouting, I remember walking over to the man, kneeling down, taking my haversack and just placing it beneath his head, trying to give him some comfort in his last moments. And then I placed the pill in his mouth, and he went quiet. And as I look up, I see one of my Gurkhas looking over towards me, and his face is covered in disgust. I was their officer. I wasn't meant to be murdering them in some jungle. I was meant to be leading them home. My apologies, I seem to have got a little carried away there, didn't I? Now, where was I? Right, yes, we'd just arrived in Burma, hadn't we? Now, once we got over the Chinlit River, we started to lay down ambushes, call in airstrikes, blow up railway lines, take those Japanese soldiers on a right merry dance through all our booby traps. But unfortunately, without that larger force to distract them, we were sitting ducks. The Japanese, you see, they just created great hunting parties, and they would ensnare our columns one by one, slowly pushing us up and up and up into the north of Burma, and eventually pushing us over the Irrawaddy. And that's when we started to face some real trouble. Supplies were not getting to us. Many of the men were falling ill from malaria. And it wasn't long after that we got our final order through. And that order was simple. Make for safety, that's what it said. That meant get yourself out of Burma. Get yourself to China, get yourself to India, just get yourself out of there. And so that night, as officers, we all gathered around one of Calvert's famous fires. You see, he built them big. He said, if you build them big, they'll think there's an army by it, and they'll never disturb you. We'd all saved a little bit of rum for this occasion, We filled our cups to the brim, and we gave a toast to the third column and everything that we had achieved. And it's at that point that Calvert decides to give us our last orders. But of course they sounded a little bit more like a speech. I remember he stands up in front of the men, and he says this: "March methodically, but do not overtire. Tiredness makes cowards of us all. If you find yourself up against it, sit down, make a cup of tea. Soon he'll sort everything out. Now if you can't find a boat to cross a river, find a boat somewhere else. Can't find a boat at all, well you wait till night and you make a draft. And whatever you do not let that hunted feeling get to you. I want to see every man with a map, distances and directions upon them. And when you get back, and you see those frontline troops, I don't want them to see some defeated army. I want them to see the drill. I want them to see the saluting. Yes, we've been under a great strain together. That is absolutely true. Let's keep our dirty washing to ourselves, shall we?" I was very thankful to having Calvert there that night. It gave us all a lot of courage that I think we sorely needed in that moment. Now the next day we break up into groups of 40 men and we go our separate ways. Personally, I made my way down south, found myself back into India. But it's on this return journey we lose most of our men. 3,000 men go out there, around 2,000 return. 120 killed in action. A handful of men, Burmese men, put to stay at home, look after their families. And while the rest were caught by the Japanese, made to work in those god-awful camps of theirs. People often ask me, how did I do it? How did I make my way through all of that? And I'm afraid I have no better answer than to say, luck. I was one of the lucky ones. Although I hear that if you go and find Mike Calvert and you ask him the very same question, he'll turn around to you and he'll say, luck. Luck had nothing to do with it. Thank you very much.